This is video lecture 7.1, the imperfect and aorist active indicative. Well, so far we've learned two tenses in Greek, and when we think about tense, remember we talk about tense in Greek, and the word tense is made up of two things. The concept of tense in Greek is made up of verbal aspect, which is the speaker's perspective on the action, how he chooses to present the action, and then with little bitty letters, we say that time is a little part of tense as well. We think about tense as primarily time, so it's a little bit more difficult for us to process the Greek verbal system. So, and time is a part, I believe, this is debated by a few people, but time is an inherent to the indicative mood. So we're looking at indicative mood verbs, past, present, and future. We remember that this is a secondary element of the tense. And we learned so far, luo, we learned about the present active indicative, which describes progressive action in the present time frame in some way. Of course, there's different nuances. The future, luso, and that, I believe, again, there's some debate about this, but I believe it looks at the action as a whole in the future, just presents it as a, without further comment on its progression or completion. We're getting ready to look at two tenses from the past. One is the imperfect tense, and it describes progressive action in the past. So translation there would be I was loosing, as opposed to the present progressive, I am loosing. The future, just a simple statement here, is I will loose. And then the other tense we're going to learn in this chapter is the aorist tense, which presents the action as just a holistic statement of what happened in the past. Of course, there are different nuances, and he speaks about some of those in the book, so we're just painting with very broad strokes at this point. Just a simple statement of what happened. I loosed. Notice the difference. A simple statement of what happened, I loosed, versus a progressive presentation of it, I was loosing. As has been said, the significant thing about the aorist is it's not significant. It's a default tense, which you automatically default to when you're going through reporting of a past historical event. Now, here are the two paradigms. I want you to memorize both of these for this chapter, as well as the paradigm for me later. And there's a song. The Greek active verb song has these endings, and that's posted and with a song sheet, so maybe that will help you learn these. Let's focus first on the imperfect. Okay, so this is the progressive action in the past. What do you, and notice here's the singular and the plural, first, second, third person singular, first, second, third person plural. The translation here, I was loosing, you were loosing, he was loosing. Notice that progression, we were loosing, y'all were loosing. That's a plural you. They were loosing. Now look at that paradigm. What do you see there? Tell me what you recognize, what's interesting. Yes, that's right. Each one of these begins with an epsilon. That is called the augment. The augment. And it is basically like a little bitty marker that, kind of like an ed on the end of a verb in English, letting us know this is in the past. The augment marks it as a past tense, as a past time event. Then you'll notice we have the stem of the verb, lu, all the way through. You have the stem. You'll notice you have a connecting vowel or a variable vowel, and then a personal ending. And there's a lot of similarities with stuff you've already learned. You're used to seeing a sigma, you're used to seeing a sigma on the end of the second singular. You're used to seeing an amen. You're used to seeing an eta. You have seen, so there's some differences as well, but there's a lot of similarity. I want you to think about how this is being built. So here's your stem, right? Lu. That's the stem of the verb. How do we get the stem of the verb? Well, we start with the lexical form luo, we cut off the ending, and that's our stem, lu. Okay, and then notice it's built with an augment. An augment is just an epsilon stuck on the beginning. And then we have, technically what you have is a connecting vowel, an omicron or an epsilon plus a personal ending. But really, those combine, and so we think about it as one thing. So, elu-on, elu-s, elu-in, that's a movable nu. Elu-amen, elu-eta, elu-on. Notice as well something interesting here. You'll notice that the first person singular and the third person plural are spelled exactly the same and accented exactly the same. So only the context can tell us whether the verb is first singular, I was loosing, or third plural, they were loosing. Whether you use the song, whether you use rote memory, be prepared to write out this paradigm on a midterm. Elu-on, elu-s, elu-in, elu-amen, elu-eta, elu-on. The other memory paradigm in this chapter is the aorist, which presents the action, just a default tense describing action in the past. And so let's look now at this side, the aorist. So you'll notice some similarities. Notice that we have an epsilon all the way through, marking this, throwing this action back into the past. But notice we have something different now. We have a sigma alpha, and in one case it's we have this result at sigma epsilon because of combinations and things, but you basically have a sigma alpha, sigma alpha, sigma alpha, here it's sigma epsilon, sigma alpha, sigma alpha, sigma alpha, all the way down through. That's called a tense morpheme. It's the aorist tense morpheme. It's a little sound unit that marks the aorist tense. And one way to remember that is that it's like the letters A and S, which are found in the AS aorist. Sigma alpha marks the aorist tense. And so the way this tense is being built, if we could build it from the ground up, we start with the stem, we have the augment, we have the sigma alpha tense morpheme, and then we have endings. And sometimes these things combine, so it's best just to memorize this part as a unit, memorize the whole thing. Elu-sa, elu-sas, elu-sin, elu-samen, elu-sata, elu-san. Notice this translation is just a simple I loosed, you loosed, he loosed, we loosed, y'all loosed, right? You guys loosed, they loosed. Now some of you are very bright students and you're wondering about some potential problems. I can almost hear your worries right now. Someone out there is wondering. They're like, yeah, but what about the verb akuo? If it begins with a vowel, if I want to do the imperfect of that, would be ku on, right? Would I have an augment and then an imperfect? You say, that looks kind of weird. Yes, your intuition is correct. I foresee that one day you will become a great Jedi, a Greek scholar. So what happens if it begins with an alpha or an epsilon, two of your most common vowels that will begin a verb, that they will lengthen in lieu of adding an epsilon? These vowels, remember we talked about vowels will shift to a cousin vowel that's considered longer, takes a little bit longer to say, and they will shift. All that means really is that they will become an eta. So if you're reading along and you have a verb that begins with an eta, almost certainly it originally began with an alpha or an epsilon, except in very few cases. There are very few words that begin with an eta in the lexical form, and it tells us this verb has been augmented. We kind of have to think backwards and say, let's see, what word do I know? Yeah, I know the word akuo. This is from akuo. And that initial vowel was lengthened, and so this is an imperfect ending. So akuon would be I was hearing. Same thing happens for the aorist, right? If this were an aorist, it would be akusa. There we would have our sigma alpha and our augment. So akusa would be I heard, where akuon would be I was hearing. Now someone else is thinking some good thoughts out there, right? I can sense it right now. Someone else is saying, what about that sigma? I bet that combines in strange ways sometimes, doesn't it? Yes. Just like with the future. Remember when you had the future and you had Pempo, and we want to do the future of that? You do not do Pempso because, remember our square of stops? We talked about the different ways that the letters will combine with the sigma, and so the future of Pempo is Pempso, and so the aorist of Pempo would be a Pempsa, right? So there we have our augment, and there we have our sigma that's combined, or sigma alpha. A Pempsa would be I sent. In the textbook, there's a summary reminding us of here you have the palatals, kappa, gamma, and chi. The palatals combine with sigma to be xi. The labials combine to be psi. And the dentals drop out when we add a sigma. Same rules apply for the aorist as did for the future. There's one other element that's important to note in this chapter as we're talking about augments. There's something called a compound verb. These are quite common in Greek. And a compound verb is where you have a root part of the verb and then a preposition attached on the beginning to make a new verb. We do this in English all the time. We have the verb hold, and then we have the verb uphold. We have the verb navigate. We have the verb circumnavigate. And so Greek does this. You have the verb luo, is to loose. Then you have the verb apoluo, to destroy. And I don't think you learn this verb at this point, but this is a compound verb. You can see the verb there, luo, already. And what do we do when we augment this? When we augment a compound verb, the augment comes prior to the main part of the verb, not before the prepositional prefix. And oftentimes, most of the time, it will knock out that last vowel. And so the imperfect, so this is what's going on. So we have appa, that's our prepositional prefix, plus our augment, plus the stem, plus we can decide imperfect, plus the imperfect ending. Remember, it's going to knock that out, and so it's going to be ap-e-luon, ap-e-luon. Now remember, you're not having to compose Greek, you're just having to recognize it. So when you come, what you're having to do now is when you're reading Greek, let's say you have you're reading along in Greek, you're having to pay attention now to more things. You're having to pay attention. Has an epsilon been added onto the beginning of the word? Has a sigma or sigma alpha been added to the end? If the word begins with a prepositional prefix, has an augment been added after that, right? Is there an augment here? And then, is that an imperfect or is that an aorist ending? It's basically like having a grammatical scalpel, and we're cutting and slicing and analyzing the little pieces to see what has been added and what has changed. There's one or two other things that we need to look at together in this chapter. And one of them is called the second aorist. Okay? So we'll come back to this slide in just a moment. Remember, we were talking about tenses, and in the past, in Greek, there's basically three important tenses that we need to know. One of them is the aorist, that looks at the action as a whole. One of them is the imperfect, that describes the action progressively. And one of them is the perfect, which views the action as completed, but as resulting in a state of affairs. The action does not continue, but a state of affairs continues into the present time frame that we're discussing. There is only one aorist tense, only one, but there are two patterns within it. It's called the first aorist and the second aorist. So second aorist, it's just talking about, is the aorist regular? Does it follow a regular pattern, first aorist, or is it more irregular? But it's so irregular that we have a term for it called second aorist. English is similar to this. Every language has irregularities. Think about when you chop vegetables, and then yesterday you chopped vegetables, and you slip on the sidewalk, and yesterday you slipped on the sidewalk, and you cook, and you learn, and then you cooked, right? So regular. We form our past tense with ed, ed, ed. And then you say, yeah, this is so easy. You can imagine someone learning English as a foreign language. I go to the store, and yesterday I goed to the store. And then we're like, I'm sorry. The past tense of go is went. And then someone could say, how in the world could I ever figure that out? And the answer is, you could not figure that out. You have to simply memorize it because it is irregular. Sometimes it's because of some historical issues in the way the word formed, or in this case, there was actually another word meaning to go that was to wend, and go has kind of hybridized and taken some forms here, and it's kind of mixed them together into a new pattern. Now, let's think about one of your verbs. You may learn it in this chapter, I believe, is lepo. Lepo means I am leaving. Lepo, I am leaving. And let's say we just learned the imperfect. You say I can do the imperfect. That the augment plus my stem, lep, plus my imperfect ending. This is easy because I have no problem. Lepon is I was leaving. Fantastic. That's right. The imperfect active indicative, or it could be even a third person plural too. They were leaving, depending on the context. It's either a first singular, I was leaving, or a third person plural, they were leaving. Now let's think about the aorist. You're like, I'm on a roll, no problem. So we have the augment, then we have the stem, lep. You're like, this is so easy. I'm going to fit plus my sigma alpha. So no problem here is lep. And you say, oh, I even got this. No problem. This is going to combine with elepsa. I left. And the answer is wrong. You're like, what did I do? How discouraging. What did I do? I say, I'm sorry, but the aorist of lepo is elepon. You look at that, you're like, how in the world could I have known that? Look, the stem is spelled differently, and it's not following what I just learned as aorist endings. How would I know that is the aorist of lepo? And the answer is you would not know unless you memorized it. That's why it's called a second aorist, an irregular aorist. You can see the pattern of the second aorist right here. This is with lepo. And you'll notice something very interesting. The second aorist, when you should memorize the initial form there. When you memorize it, you're memorizing it with the augment on there, right? Augment means past time. It actually follows, the second aorist forms follow imperfect endings. I want you to notice that. These are imperfect endings. Here's the imperfect. On, s, in, amen, eta, on. These are imperfect. These also have the augment. So someone's like, how am I going to tell the difference between the imperfect and the aorist? Both the imperfect and second aorist have an augment. Both follow imperfect endings, right? We're talking about the second aorist. Both the imperfect and second aorist follow imperfect endings. How will I know the difference? Well, the answer is the stem. There's a spelling change in the stem. Sometimes it's even more radical than that. Sometimes it's a slight change, but sometimes it's more radical. For example, the verb Lego. What is the aorist of Lego? Based on what you know, you say, you would try to plug it in. You say, okay, epsilon plus my stem plus my sigma alpha, and I've studied the square of stops, and I reckon that's going to become, you'll be so proud of yourself. You write this out, you're like, oh, this is so good. Alexa. And the answer is, You're like, what did I do wrong? And I say the second aorist. Aha, see, that's the key. Second. The second aorist of Lego is apon. Apon. And you look at that and you throw your pencil on the floor and you almost want to walk away. But the truth is, this is just like English. Go and went. It's just one of these ones we have to memorize. Notice you're memorizing this form with the augment. You're memorizing it with the imperfect ending. There's a whole list of these in the vocabulary. And I highly recommend that you memorize them. Of course, at one level, recognition is sufficient, but usually what you memorize now, you recognize later. So on quizzes and tests, I could give you a second aorist form, say, what's the lexical form of this? The lexical form of apon is Lego. Do you understand that? The lexical form of apon is Lego, because this is the form we look up in the dictionary. Apon is the irregular aorist form. You say, in most verbs, a few verbs have a first aorist form and a second aorist, but most verbs, they either form the aorist in the regular pattern, first declension, or they form it in the irregular pattern, second declension. As you look through the verbs that are second aorist, here's a sampling of ones that have second aorist from the textbook. I want you to notice a pattern that a lot of the verbs that have a second aorist, let's go back there. A lot of the verbs that have a second aorist end in a specific way. I want you to pay attention to this. A lot of the second aorist verbs end in ano, ino, ino, or isco, sometimes just no. So when you have a verb whose lexical form ends in ano, ino, ino, isco, you can kind of expect that's going to drop out in some way. Maybe a vowel will shift or change, and the aorist will be a second aorist. Same thing with verbs that end in isco. So here's the verb, for example, heurisco, I find. The second aorist is Huron. Hamartano is I sin. The second aorist is Hamartan. Remember, you're memorizing this with the augment. These are all memorized with the augment on there and with the imperfect endings. The difference is a spelling change in the stem. That is the significance, the significant difference that lets us know that we are dealing with a second aorist. One final thing we have to mention in this chapter is that you need to memorize the imperfect paradigm of ami. So we've learned the present with ami, ast. That is Greek to me. I stand alone on the Word of God, Esmond, SDC. But you also need to learn now, we need to be able to speak about things in the past and say, I was. Right? This is just the imperfect of ami. I was, you were, he was, we were, y'all were, they were. And you'll see some real similarities, things you've already learned. Sigma here, you're seeing a nu here, a min, a t, a san. So there's a lot of similarities, but in the end, we need to be able to write this out from memory on a quiz or on an exam. So I'll just pronounce it for us. Amen, ace, ain, amen, eta, or we might say eta, ason. Okay, good. So this is the end of video lecture 7.1, the imperfect and aorist active indicative.